Hello aviators, Sky here, and today we have a giant video about a giant airplane. Giant not so much in its size, but rather in its fame. Yes, the most beloved by the Hollywood, adored by travelers, and in general the most famous airliner on our beautiful planet. Make yourselves comfortable. Boeing 747. So the Boeing 747 is a 4-engine wide-body airliner developed by Boeing in the late 1960s. The aircraft has an unofficial name Jumbo Jet, and apart from the large size, it is known of course for its famous hump. Launched into the market in 1970, for 37 years it was the largest passenger airliner in the world. The history of this giant began back in the early 1960s, at the very moment when the US Air Force required a large transport aircraft. Yes, they already had the C-141 Starlifter, a very decent aircraft, but it still was not big enough. In 1964, the Pentagon initiated CX-HLS, or the Heavy Logistics System program. The military needed an aircraft capable of carrying about 80 tons of cargo at a speed of about 800 km per hour for the distance of up to 9,300 kilometers. The cargo hold also had to be much larger than any created earlier. To say that the creation of such an aircraft was a challenge would be an understatement. No one was doing anything like it back then. The huge Soviet An-22 Ante, created at that time, was almost half its size, and the rather heavy C-141 Starlifter seemed like a minibus. It was clear that the aircraft needed 4 jet engines, but even so, the engines this powerful simply didn't exist back then. The best models were several times weaker than what the military needed. The tender was attended by all major manufacturers. Leaders in the aircraft development were Boeing and Lockheed, while the engines were developed by General Electric and Pratt & Whitney. One of the main problems was the requirement of loading the cargo from the front. The standard configuration of the fuselage was abandoned immediately, and the developers decided to move the cockpit up. This practice already took place in the industry, but remained exotic. Lockheed made the upper deck narrow and low, but stretched it almost along the entire length of the plane, like a kind of a spine, and Boeing made a large hump behind the cabin, ending near the leading edge of the wing. Now somebody will ask, what does any of it have to do with the civilian Boeing 747? It would have nothing to do with it, if not for one respectable guy. Juan Terry Tripp, one of the pioneers of aviation, the founder and the president of Pan American World Airways. This airline's impact on the market was very high, including the Boeing. In the late 1960s, the growing air transportation market increased the pressure on airports and planes, and airliners such as Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8 were no longer efficient enough. Juan Tripp, being a big deal person in the industry, of course knew about the CX-HLS program, and seeing the performance of the future military transports, he came to a simple conclusion. If they can do it for the Pentagon, they can also do it for me. This was very helpful when, in 1965, the tender CX-HLS was won by the Lockheed. Actually, their plane is still successfully flying. It was the largest American transport C-5 Galaxy. But the losing Boeing didn't just throw away its research. The project to create the passenger airplane on the basis of HLS experience was led by one of the members of the Boeing 737 development team, Joe Sutter. He launched a wide joint research along with the airlines, and that was when the sacred index was heard for the first time, 747. Moreover, no one was sure that the aircraft would be successful. In addition, at that time many believed that soon the sky would be conquered by the supersonic airliners. So, for safety, the aircraft retained the transport role and the possibility of loading through the nose. Ideally, they were planning to transport passengers on the supersonic Tu-707 and cargo on the larger 747. That is why the cockpit, the upper deck and the hump were preserved, although the wing was moved from the top of the fuselage downwards into the classic format. In 1966, Boeing received the first $525 million order. The full-scale work had begun. On the early stages, engineers offered to stretch the hump for the entire length of the fuselage and make a full-size upper deck. However, this scheme did not make a lot of sense. Such a huge passenger capacity was not needed, there was nowhere to put so much luggage, and the evacuation of such a large aircraft in the time limits set by the regulators, 90 seconds, was impossible. As a result, they returned to the idea of a hump, slightly narrowed and shortened version of the upper deck. But with this layout, it was unclear what to put up there. It was suggested that they would put something like a resting area or a lounge, as the Emirates love to do it now. Let's return to the engines. I'll jump a little forward. The thrust on the Boeing 747-100 engine, the very first generation, reached 230 kilonewtons. Just to be clear, it's almost 3 times more than the thrust of Boeing 707 engine. It was clear that local improvements would not achieve such growth. For the military transport, General Electric and Pratt & Whitney developed a breakthrough technology of high bypass engines. Yes, now such engines are everywhere, but then it was an innovation. And if General Electric made engines for the C5 Galaxy, Pratt & Whitney decided to hang their freshly baked JT9D under the wing of the Boeing 747, though it didn't go without adventures. The infrastructure was another serious challenge. The airports were adapted for turboprops and jet planes, but a giant ship like the Boeing 747 was too large for them. No one could afford to wait for better times, when the runways would become bigger. It was necessary to make the airplane capable of working with the modern airports. To do this, the plane received the undercarriage with a total of 5 gears, as well as the most advanced mechanization of the wing, allowing it to fly at minimal speed while landing. Joe Sutter's team was working crazy hard for 28 months, while their colleagues from other projects of the company considered them insane and fanatical. At the same time, debts were constantly growing, and the risks were so great that the management was often accused of adventurism, that they were in fact jeopardizing the entire company. The problems were not ending there. The evacuation proved to be quite a challenge. They could not reach the 90 seconds indicator, and some volunteers even got injured during the tests. Only after weeks of working and redesigning the structural elements, this problem was resolved. The pilot's training was not easy too. There were no airplanes with such high cockpits. It especially concerned the airplane movement on the airfield. To train the pilots, the so-called Waddle Truck was created, in honor of Jack Waddle, the leading pilot of the program. Technically, it was a cockpit mock-up, mounted on a truck which, surrounded by engineers, was driving around the airport. Another challenge was the establishment of serious production, and the problem was not in the equipment purchases or staff training. Boeing simply didn't have a plant that would make it possible to organize such a production. The factory in Renton was large, but it was producing narrow-body airliners which, in comparison with the new plane, seemed like babies. The decision was, although expensive, but the only possible. In 1966, the company bought 790 acres of land, 50 kilometers from Seattle, near the Painfield Air Base, and began the construction of a new plant, the famous and giant Boeing plant, which can be seen in many of their videos. Now it is the largest in the world in terms of inside volume, and it is where all the wide-body Boeing airliners are being manufactured. And so, the video lasts quite a while now, and the plane has not yet taken off. In September 1968, the prototype Boeing 747-100 passed a solemn rollout ceremony at a new plant in Everett in the presence of employees, journalists, and airline representatives. In February 1969, at last, Jumbo Jet made its maiden flight. Flight tests had become yet another arena for fighting the problems that the giant had to face. The large wing had a huge span, and under certain conditions it started to twist. In addition, at high speeds, the plane could lose the flight stability, and this could lead to a flutter. As a result, the design was reinforced and modified, and an additional load of depleted uranium was added to the tail to level the center of mass. Oh yes, uranium. But that was the early versions. Boeing doesn't use it anymore. This decision was logical but rather controversial, especially after the plane crash of Boeing 747 in Amsterdam, when rescuers had to search for almost 300 kilograms of missing uranium in the burning ruins of buildings. And now the main problem of the airliner. This is where we go back to the JT9D engines. Innovations do not happen without problems. The newest motors were so large that the fans and turbines were easily getting deformed. Pratt Whitney, along with Boeing, spent a lot of time and burned a bunch of those engines. And the money were flowing away. Because of these problems, the first delivery was postponed several times, and on the parking near the plant, the planes with naked wings were standing in anticipation of their power plants. But in the end, this barrier was overcome as well. In the summer of 1969, the plane was sent to Paris Air Show, and at the end of that year, the Boeing 747-100 received the type certificate. In January of 1970, the first airliner was delivered to Pan Am. The model entered the market quite slowly, mainly due to the fact that many airports still could not accept it. However, this problem, as well as the periodic difficulties with reliability, proved to be quite solvable. After the reception of the aircraft by Pan Am, its competitors were also in a hurry to purchase a new flagship, which raised demand. There was even an argument that airlines wanted to have this aircraft not as much for its efficiency as for the status. So let's see in a little more detail what kind of a bird is this jumbo. The Boeing 747 is a 4-engine, wide-body airliner with 2 passenger decks. The wing is swept, adapted for flights on speeds up to 950 km per hour. Moreover, the sweep angle was raised, not so much for the sake of the speeding up, but for increasing the wing area while keeping the wingspan within reasonable limits. The passenger cabin on the main deck basically assumes a 3+4+3 scheme in the economy class and 2+3+2 in business class, with 2 aisles between the rows. The upper deck has a cabin scheme 3+3 in the economy class and 2+2 in business class, with 1 aisle between the rows. Initially, the hump was rather short, but already in the 100B version, the aircraft could optionally receive an elongated upper deck. And this deck was made even larger in the modern modification, Boeing 747-8i. The cockpit is inside the nose section in the upper deck. It was originally designed for 3 crew members, but evolved. Now it is unified with other wide-body Boeing airplane cockpits. The maximum takeoff weight of the aircraft was constantly growing from version to version, from 333 tons in Model 100 to 448 tons in the Model 8. The range has also increased from 8,600 kilometers to 14,300 kilometers. The times when the Boeing 747 was created left its mark on it. A liner has a lot of elements needed back then, but not so important now. Sometimes these elements are redundant. For example, back in the late 1960s, the aircraft was designed with a very advanced mechanization of the wing. It was necessary to ensure a minimal speed when landing on an insufficiently long runways. But now, the airports are adapted and are able to accept airliners without problems. As a result, such an advancement is not that necessary. Another interesting point, Boeing 747 is certified for flights with 3 engines. Even if one of the engines fails right after the takeoff, the plane will be able to continue its flight in a normal mode. At one time, Boeing had a plan to create a 3-engine version, but this plan was abandoned. And yes, quite rarely, but still, the Boeing 747 can be seen with 5 engines. This is not a special version, as it may seem. Everything is much more simple. The aircraft has the ability to suspend the engine for its transportation, so it's nothing more than a cargo load. And the most interesting part, the excessive performance of the undercarriage. In the early 1970s, the airplane was too heavy for many runways. Therefore, its main landing gear has 4 bogies at once, to distribute the weight more evenly. Now, 4 bogies are redundant. The Boeing 747 is capable of landing even if 2 landing gears under the fuselage remained retracted. Let's take a look on the modifications. The basic version was, of course, the 747-100. The range is about 8,600 kilometers. Capacity is up to 550 passengers. But this is not enough for us, is it? Boeing quickly made a couple of versions with increased range and capacity. Version 200 appeared shortly, in 1971. It became heavier, received more powerful engines and also a cargo version. It was the basis for the 747 SP with a shortened fuselage, capable of flying very far but looking pretty ridiculous. In 1980, the Boeing 747-300 was born. Extended upper deck, high cruise speed, capacity, beautiful. Naturally, all the branches of the plane were also there. In 1989, the most advanced version Boeing 747-400 was created. It is the most popular. Now, most of the 747s are off this version. The plane received a new cockpit for 2 pilots, updated construction materials and interiors. The plane was being developed for 4 years, but it was worth it. Model 400 began to fly for 14,200 kilometers. Takeoff weight had risen by almost 100 tons compared to the first model, and capacity increased to maximum 660 packs. Further evolution was not so smooth. In the early 1990s, there were plans to create versions 500 and 600, but the program was too expensive. In addition, the appearance of the Boeing 777 had taken away a significant chunk of the market from Jumbo. In the year 2000, Boeing once again took on the subject of modernization to answer the future European A380, but again the project stopped. Therefore, the company started the program Sonic Cruiser. The transonic airplane, as we know, was not born. Soon Boeing's statements were referred to as politicians' promises. A lot of words and little business. But the guys from Seattle were rehabilitated, creating the Boeing 787 Dreamliner. By this time, the work on the successor of the Jumbo family was already being carried out in the company's walls. The project received an index Boeing 747-8. The fuselage of the new model was 5.6 meters longer than that of its predecessors, which made it the longest in the line and, in general, the longest airliner in the world. The capacity of the upper deck reached the total capacity of the Boeing 737. The power plant, 4 new General Electric GEnx 2B67 engines, made the liner more economical and environmental friendly. The cockpit got many elements of the Boeing 787 cockpit. The wing was also widely redesigned, and got wingtips similar to the Dreamliner's tips. The cargo capacity of the Transport 747-8F version reached 140 tons. Now it is the second transport aircraft in the world, after the Un-225. Like all cargo models, the 747-8F has the ability to be loaded from the front with a retractable nose section. The passenger version received the name 747-8I, Intercontinental, as once did one of the Boeing 707 modifications. It can accommodate up to 467 passengers in a 3-class layout cabins, and fly at a range of up to 14,300 kilometers. The first airliner was transferred to Lufthansa in 2012. Of course, the Boeing 747 has, let's say, more special modifications. Here are the most interesting of them. I've already talked about one of them, Boeing 747 LCF Dreamlifter, an aircraft elements carrier with a crazy large fuselage. Somewhere in my playlists there is a separate video about it. E-4B is an aerial command post, the aircraft of the Judgment Day. Like its predecessor E-6, it was created for the remote control of the US Armed Forces, including the nuclear weapons. In total, 4 such aircraft were made. Boeing 747 SCA, Shuttle Carrier Aircraft. 2 747-100 aircraft were converted and used by NASA to transport space shuttles. Boeing 747 Evergreen Supertanker, modification of the model 747-200, made to provide aerial firefighting. This thing can drop 76 tons of water on your head at once. Boeing YEL-1 is an experimental airborne platform for the anti-missile laser complex for the US Missile Defense Program. After conducting a series of tests in 2014, it was dismantled. Boeing 747 SOFIA, Stratospheric Observatory for Infrared Astronomy, the former Boeing 747 SP airliner of Pan Am. It was modified and equipped with a research complex and a large infrared telescope. The aircraft is used by NASA and DLR, Airspace Center of Germany. And of course, the most famous special version, Boeing VC-25, the VIP board of the US Air Force, developed on the basis of Boeing 747-200B. 2 such aircraft with numbers 28,000 and 29,000 are operated for the transportation of the US President and are well known as the Air Force One. The cabin was designed in accordance with the requirements of Nancy Reagan in the late 1980s. The aircraft started operations in 1990s under the presidency of George H.W. Bush. Now, Boeing is engaged in the creation of 2 new presidential planes, based on the already built 747-8I aircraft. Interesting that these planes were built for the Russian Transaero airline, but the company went bankrupt and the planes stayed in Everett. 2 new Air Force Ones are planned to be delivered in 2020. In total, during the period from 1968 to spring 2018, 1,544 aircraft of the Boeing 747 family were produced. 488 aircraft are in operation. Most of them are Model 747-400. The aircraft is operated by 65 airlines around the world. In addition, some aircraft are made in the VIP modification and are being used as boards of the heads of state of Bahrain, India, China, Iran, Japan, Kuwait, Oman, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Several VIP boards are also used by private customers. The Boeing 747 holds a record of one-time transportation of people. During the evacuation of the Ethiopian refugees in 1991 to Israel, one aircraft took on board 1,122 people. The Boeing 747 airlines were involved in 146 accidents, 61 of which led to the destruction of the aircraft and death of 3,722 people. The planes were hijacked 32 times. Also, the largest air crash in the history of aviation occurred on the island of Tenerife, when 2 Boeing 747 collided on the runway. 583 people were killed and 61 were injured. A few years ago, when Airbus brought its flagship to the market, they had a slogan: "Better than the A380 can only be another A380." It turned out to be true. Despite all the upgrades, the shrinking of the market of large 4-engine airliners, as well as the competitive pressure of the A380, constantly reduced the demand for Boeing 747. In 2016, the company reduced production to 6 aircraft per year. Given the very low demand, Boeing is considering an issue of stopping the production completely by 2019. Usually I say that the story of the liner doesn't end there, but this time apparently it may end after all. Although Jumbo will still be flying for a long time. As will all of us, I hope. Like, subscribe, and comment below what do you think about this legendary giant. Fast flights and soft landings to you.